I have a little bit of a pleasant surprise here for you when it comes to VRRP. You've already been learning it when you were studying HSRP. Defined in RFC 2338, VRRP is the open standard equivalent of HSRP, and the operation of the two is very similar. I could put a huge VRRP doc in front of you right now that went through every little detail of the operation, and it would all seem familiar to you because you've already learned it with HSRP. Of course, the terminology is a little different here and there, and I've got some of that here on the board for you. A couple of differences you should be aware of. VRRP's equivalent to the active router is the master router, and I've seen some documentation refer to that router as the IP address owner. It's not a terribly common phrase, but I want you to know about that one. But just like in HSRP, we've got physical routers. We put them in a group. They combine to form a pseudo router or virtual router. VRRP advertisements are multicast to 224.0.0.18, and VRRP's equivalent to the standby router state is the backup state. So with HSRP we have active and standby, and with VRRP we have master and backup. But that's what I meant by putting a doc in front of you that was just VRRP. And just from knowing HSRP, you would know what's going on. Now, one major difference I want you to know about is that preempt is a default setting for VRRP routers. That's a pretty important detail and a big difference. And there is a reserved MAC address also for our VRRP virtual router, 0005E0001, and we know what that double X is at the end. It is the group number in hexadecimal. Seems like a little bit of a pattern there. We'll see if that pattern holds up with our third option for router redundancy, GLBP. And if this is the first time you've seen it, it does work a lot differently than HSRP does. Some of the concepts are the same, but there's some different terminology, some different router roles. So I've got some lab work here to reinforce it as well. So hang in there if it's the first time you've seen it, because it's a little bit thicker than HSRP. The great thing about GLBP, the Gateway Load Balancing Protocol, hello name is the recipe, is that it brings us really true load balancing. And by that, I really mean load balancing that we can tie down to where we want it. Let's say we had 3 routers that were going to share the workload. We saw multi-group HSRP, and I wouldn't go as far to call it a gimmick. It works, but it's not something where we could really say, okay, we want router 1 to handle 60% of the workload, we want router 2 to handle 20%, and router 3 to handle another 20%. GLBP allows us to do that, and by the way, GLBP is also Cisco proprietary. Now, the concepts that are the same, GLBP routers, you're going to take them, you're going to put them in a router group. And you're creating, again, a pseudo router. But a major difference is that GLBP allows every router in the group to handle some of the load. And by default, that is in a round-robin format. And you'll see what I mean by that here shortly. Now, instead of, thankfully, with HSRP, of course, we know by default you have the primary router handling all the workload and the standby routers remain idle. Even better, with GLBP, the hosts think they're sending all of their data to a single gateway, but you and I, as the network admins, we know the truth. Multiple gateways are actually in use simultaneously. Now, you might think, well, what's a big deal, about that? Well, having lived through some of those other configs in my life, I can tell you that this is the great part about GLBP. It allows standard configuration of the hosts. Their gateways, their gateway addresses are all going to be set to that virtual router's IP address. There's not going to be any of this, some hosts are going to point to gateway A and some hosts are going to point to gateway B business that we had with HSRP load balancing. That's the huge benefit of it. We really have per host load balancing with much more control over how the balancing takes place than the other 2 protocols offer, which I grant you is a backhanded compliment because those 2 protocols really don't give us much control over that. Now, when I mentioned that you'll see more of these techniques in future studies, I do have some lab work here for you on GLBP, including one show command that is commonly misinterpreted, and you will not misinterpret it after we're done with it. Believe me, we're going to do surgery on that thing. I will show you how to change the default from round robin as far as the load balancing goes, but when it comes to waiting and the other option that we have that you'll see, we can't go into the configuration of that. We have to stop somewhere, but you'll definitely see it in the future. And if you want to study a little of that on your own after you're done getting your NA, fantastic idea. Now, the key here, or the operation, is when a host sends an ARP request for the MAC of the virtual router, one of the physical routers is going to answer that with a virtual MAC that has been assigned to that router, or maybe another router. And you'll see what's going on here in just a moment with an illustration. At that point, the host has the IP address it needs, the destination IP address, which will be that of the GLBP virtual router, and it will also have a MAC address, which will be a virtual MAC address of a physical router. Now let's take an illustrated look at this operation, and you'll see exactly what's going on here. Let me zip to the next screen. And here we are, and we've got 6 requests coming in for the MAC address of 10.1.1.10. We have a virtual router that has that IP address. We also have 3 routers that are going to be handling the workload. And there is a reserved virtual MAC address, so they will not look like this in production. We will see that shortly in a lab. But just for simplicity's sake, I made router 2's virtual MAC all 2's, R3's virtual MAC is all 3's, and R4's virtual MAC is all 4's. Now, before those ARP requests were ever sent, though, there was an election. And hey, what is a Cisco protocol without some kind of election? What we're electing here is the Active Virtual Gateway, the AVG. The AVG is kind of the boss of the entire GLBP operation. It's a supervisor, if you will. Now, the AVG will assign itself a virtual MAC address, and it will also assign each router in the GLBP group a virtual MAC address. And it's those virtual MAC addresses that will be sent as replies to those ARP requests. And at that point, each router in the group is what we call an active virtual forwarder, an AVF. So we have 2 terms there that are really close to each other, so let's revisit that for just a moment. The AVG is elected at the beginning of the process when these routers are enabled with GLBP. That AVG assigns itself a virtual MAC address. It also assigns each of the other routers in the group a virtual MAC address, and at that point, each router in the group is an active virtual forwarder. That's up to 4, by the way. You can have up to 4 routers serving as AVFs. Now, what's going to happen at this point is the AVG is going to answer the ARP request. It's taken that workload on its own. But what it does, it answers them with different MAC addresses. And by default, the AVG will reply with different MAC addresses in a round-robin format. So it's going to send router 2's virtual MAC out, and then it's going to send its own, and then it would send router 4's. And you can see the responses that are coming from the AVG in this point. A couple of hosts are getting R2's virtual MAC address, a couple of them are getting R3's virtual MAC address, and a couple of them are getting R4's virtual MAC address. Now, that by itself, just left at the default, is far superior to what we could do with HSRP. Now, the hosts at that point are all going to have 10.1.1.10 as their default gateway, but some will have their address mapped to R2's MAC in their ARP cache, some will have R3's MAC, and some will have R4's MAC, and that gives us the load balancing we want while being able to keep the same default gateway IP address on all the hosts, which is wonderful. Now, if the AVG fails, and we've seen this in our election processes in this course as well, the router serving as the standby AVG will take over. If any of the AVFs fail, another router will handle the load destined for a MAC on the downed router. We're going to see that in action. I'm going to expand our lab that we've got. We're going to make some things fail so you can see exactly what's going on there. But again, we elect a standby AVG in advance, and if the AVG fails, then the router serving as the standby AVG will take over. If any of our forwarders fails, another router will take that load destined for that MAC that the failed AVF had. That MAC address doesn't just go up in smoke. The default GLBP hold time, dead time is 10 seconds, by the way, and how they determine that one of the routers in their group is gone, hellos, again. And the address there for GLBP hellos is 224.0.0.102. Now, GLBP's load balancing really gives us the opportunity to fine-tune the load balancing to our needs. And I've mentioned a couple times the term round-robin, excuse me. And with round-robin assignments, a host that sends an ARP request will receive a response containing the next virtual MAC address in line, basically. Now, just a little bit about these other options, and I'm going to show you this one command, and then we'll head into the lab. If you have a host or hosts who need the same MAC gateway address every single time they send an ARP request, you need to use what we call host-dependent load balancing. We also have a situation, remember when I said something about, we could make one router handle about 60% of the load, another one handle 20, another one handle 20, however we want to split it up. Well, weighted MAC assignments affect the percentage of traffic that will be sent to a given AVF. The higher the assigned weight, the more often that particular router's virtual MAC will be sent to a requesting host. Now, I kind of wish we could go into that. I have to stop there because it's definitely not an NA topic, but that is just a fantastic tool because you can really tie your load balancing down exactly the way you want it. Also, as I mentioned here on the board, you can choose one of these three with the GLBP load balancing command. Sorry, it's all in italics. Should just be GLP load balancing. I'll take care of that. But you really need to do a little bit of research on that. You're not going to cripple anything, but you don't want to just dive in and say, okay, I think I want it 42, 38, 20, or whatever you want it. Get away from everything, do a little work, decide how you really want to handle your load balancing, and then have at it. That's what you do with the GLBP load balancing command, and that number you see there on the board, of course, is the GLBP group. GLBP is enabled just as VRRP and HSRP are. It's by assigning an IP address to the virtual router. Now, what I'm going to do is set up routers 1 and 3 on a broadcast segment, and I'm going to configure them with the GLBP 10 IP 172.1.1.10 command. I'll do that live because I want you to see the output of this command. Because one show command that we're going to come back to time and time and time again is show GLBP brief. And if you're thinking, okay, well, if there's a brief option, there must be a show GLBP. There is, and we'll get into that at the end, but that's several screens of information. I want you to see the brief version first. So when we come back, we'll start the lab there, start the lab period, and I want to show you that show GLBP brief command because I want you to be patient with this command when you first enable GLBP, because the first line of the output tends to appear by itself at first, and you think, oh, something's wrong. Then you go troubleshoot it, and you come back and you run it, and all of a sudden the other lines you were seeing are there. So you have to give it a minute or two, but we'll do that live on the very next video. See you there.